This is Research Like a Pro, episode 183, American Nations Part 2 with Heidi Mathis. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Research Like a Pro today.
Hi, Nicole. How are you today?
I am doing well. How are you, Diana?
I am doing well. Exciting to have a new year, 2022. When I was a little girl, I just couldn't even envision what it was going to be like in 2022, and here we are. It's kind of fun and exciting. Well, we're also happy to have Heidi Mathis back. Hi, Heidi.
Hello.
We're excited to talk about part 2 of our American Nations series. So, Nicole, what have you been working on?
It's been fun. We've been talking about a new product we want to have on our Family Locket Genealogist Services arm, and they kind of revolve around helping you with your DNA. So one of them is a DNA research plan where we review kind of what you have and then make a plan for what to do next. And then also a DNA research consultation where instead of writing out a plan, we can review what you have and then just talk with you about some next steps. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and click on the links to those products in our show notes.
Yeah, we're excited to have some new services because we've worked with so many people now in our DNA study group, and we realize that there are so many different needs out there for helping you learn how to use your DNA and genealogy. So for announcements, we have our spring DNA study group beginning February 16th, and registration is open for that. If by chance it is full by the time this podcast airs, just email us for the waiting list. And the email for that would be nicole@familylocket.com. And then just to put on your schedule for 2022, our fall study group will begin in September. And that is our regular Research Like a Pro study group without DNA. So if you haven't done one of our study groups before, that's a great one to start with because we focus just on the documentary work. And we love working with everyone in our study groups. So we hope to see all of you at one point or another. Please join our newsletter for coupons so you get first notice of that.
Well, let's talk to Heidi now. So Heidi, can you review what we talked about in the last podcast?
Absolutely. We were talking about this book I read that I loved for how it applies to genealogy. It's called American Nations by Colin Woodard. It gives us a macro overview of American history that can help us see how the communities and historical forces that were shaping the places where our ancestors lived, the idea that our ancestor had their own small fan club, but that their small fan club connected to a larger network of people or fan clubs that you can see in ancestry communities and in people's DNA. And in this study that Colin Woodard talked about in his blog post from the magazine Nature Communications, where they clustered 770,000 genomes and showed how it really dovetailed with his theory in American Nations. And last time, we just kind of introduced the idea of American nations, and we talked about the two main nations of Yankeedom and the southern ones of Tidewater in the Deep South. And we talked about the Civil War and how those nations are kind of battling each other and bringing in the other smaller nations. And in this podcast, I'm hoping that we can talk more about the theory that underlies his book and as well as kind of go over each of those 11 nations.
Yes, I think it'll be great to go through each one of those because we probably all have ancestors who were in multiple. I know there are some people that their ancestors come to one spot and they're just kind of there, like New England roots, and that's it. But, you know, if you're like me, you've kind of got these groups all over the place. So it'll be fun to go through each one. So let's talk about the main hypothesis behind the book, American Nations.
Yeah, if you had to be very concise, you'd say that American Nations presents a theory that it's the first people who settle an area have an outsized effect on the culture that develops in that area, and that other people coming in, wherever they're from, will more adopt that first settlement culture. before they're even their own. So European colonization in the 17th and 18th century and the 19th century devastated the indigenous people of North America that were here first through disease and forced relocation, dishonest treaties, and relentless violent conflict. And this unspeakable tragedy resulted in the loss of American Indian culture in the lands that the Europeans colonized. And American Nations posits that mostly blank cultural slate that was left behind was filled by the first European cultures to take root in whatever area they were coming to. He built his theory from several sources, but the most important is this guy, Wilbur Zielinski, who first proposed this theory called the Doctrine of First Effective Settlement in 1973. And I'll quote Zielinski. It says, "Whenever an empty territory undergoes settlement or an earlier population is dislodged by invaders, the specific characteristics of the first group able to effect a viable self-perpetuating society are of crucial significance for the latter social and cultural geography of the area, no matter how tiny the initial band of settlers may have been." Unquote. So American Nations argues that no matter what culture your ancestor came from originally, where they settled in the U.S. would greatly affect where they and their descendants may have migrated and who they married and perhaps even what political party they may have supported. So today, like I was saying, I'd like to go through each of these 11 nations in a real short snapshot. And in his book, obviously, he develops these ideas much more extensively.
Wow, so interesting. And I think that quote by Wilbur Zielinski was fascinating, that this idea of a viable self-perpetuating society and how people bring with them whatever their cultural and their social mores are to this blank slate. Fascinating. Okay, so let's start with El Norte, which is the southern part of California, Arizona, most of New Mexico, and northern Mexico. So basically the southwest United States now, but called El Norte. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this one was so interesting to me. If you would have asked me what was the first of these 11 nations to settle, I would have thought you would have said the English colonists, which shows you that I don't always think things through. But actually, the English weren't the first here. The oldest European communities in the US are in the desert Southwest, and they were the Spanish. The Spanish were the superpowers in the 16th century, and so they were the first Europeans to settle in North America. They were in Kansas and Oregon and Florida and Virginia before the English. One of the oldest European communities in North America is this El Norte, and it goes back to 1595 in New Mexico. The oldest building in the U.S. is the Palace of the Governors, and it was built in 1610 in Santa Fe. I wouldn't have been able to tell you that. Woodard argues that the people of the Southwest and northern Mexico, which make up El Norte, have more in common with each other than they do with the rest of their countries. So the people in New Mexico have more in common with the people of northern Mexico, and those people in northern Mexico have more in common with the people in New Mexico than they do with the rest of Mexico.
That's so interesting. I know that when I was studying Texas history, you also have that same, it's a little bit further east than this area, but you also have that Spanish and Mexican influence there way before you have other people. So great to know.
And hey, I live in that area, so I should go visit some of these old buildings and things. You probably have been to some of the old missions. I think those are still around, and some of those old buildings from the early Spanish settlement.
Absolutely. I'm originally from California. And so all the haciendas and stuff that were there were definitely from this El Norte community.
Right. Okay, well, let's move to New France. Tell us about Quebec, parts of Nova Scotia, and Louisiana.
Yeah. So also before the English, in 1604, there were 79 Frenchmen that arrived in what later would be called Acadia, which is today parts of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and parts of eastern Maine. Woodard sums up this nation by explaining that one of the earlier governors, called Samuel de Champlain, wanted a feudal society like France had, but they had a slightly different view of Native Americans than the English or the Spanish. And so I'll quote Woodard. He says, He, meaning Champlain, believed that New France should coexist in a friendly, respectful alliance with the Native American nations. And instead of conquering and enslaving the Indians, as the Spanish had, or driving them away, as the English would, New France would embrace the Native Americans and assimilate with them. Later, these Acadians would move to Louisiana and become Cajuns, and then more French settlers would arrive in Quebec, where they obviously dominate to this day. And Woodard argues that the nation of New France has consistently been the most liberal of the 11 nations. For example, Woodard says that though Louisiana was a slave state, its view of slavery differed from the Deep South nation, and some of its slave owners were Unionists. In other words, the settlers from New France influenced Louisiana to be more liberal than its immediate neighbors, Deep South. And likewise, in Quebec, it was also more liberal than its neighbors from the nearby provinces that were, like, for example, Ontario was settled by Midlanders, and it's definitely more conservative than Quebec.
Well, I really see that in Louisiana with the treatment of the enslaved people and the Native Americans. It was much different there. And you see them owning land and being granted their freedom more. And so as time progressed, Louisiana became more like the other members of the Deep South, but especially in the early 1700s, probably up to early 1800s, it was quite different. So that French influence was certainly, like you said, it was dominant.
I wonder, we have seen with some of our DNA study group members that those with ancestry in Quebec, Nova Scotia, and some of those areas do have some intermarriage within their family trees, some pedigree collapse. I think the Acadians, maybe. I'm not sure, but I wonder if that's a similar thing in Louisiana, but maybe it was just up in Canada.
That's a great question.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I learned in what book I read about this, I can't remember now. It might have been some of Elizabeth Shown Mill's work because she does a lot, in that area. But France definitely had its hierarchy, and so when they came over directly from France, they had to try to marry someone of a similar class. And so if there wasn't somebody available, then they would have an alliance with someone of a lesser class, like an African American woman or a Native American woman, but they were not allowed to really marry them. So those are the situations I've seen, but they treated them really well sometimes. You never know for sure, right?
Right. I
But the
don't
records look like they do.
It's only in comparison to how the Native Americans were treated in other nations that they stand out, and that early on there was a lot more working together, and if you look back at the French and Indian War, it's called that because the French and the Native Americans were mostly fighting with each other against the English. The English did have some Native Americans, but generally the French did seem to form more equal alliances with Native Americans.
Hmm. When I think more about Louisiana, I feel like the people who have had DNA from this area, they do have more intermarriage with Native Americans, or at least, like Diana said, they maybe didn't marry them, but they had children together. So I think they don't have that same problem of as much pedigree collapse as is found among some of the other people in New France up in Canada.
It's so interesting to think about how this plays out, kind of on the ground level. And we're kind of doing it right now. It's a lens that we're using to try to understand the different cultures that are in the United States.
Well, let's move to a new area. I would love to keep talking about this, and I was going to do some Google searching about endogamy in Louisiana, but I think we'll move on to Yankeedom. So tell us more about the people in New England who migrated to northern Ohio, west across the upper Midwest, and then founded the Pacific coastal cities.
Yeah, well, Yankeedom, like we talked about in the last podcast, along with the Tidewater in the Deep South, has exerted, one of the greatest influences on U.S. history. The settlers of Yankeedom were mostly Puritans who had supported Oliver Cromwell and Parliament in the English Civil War of the 1640s. And those from Yankeedom to this day tend to be more utopian and egalitarian zealous, just like the first settlers in the early 17th century in New England. They believed in the importance of education, of debate, and of coming to consensus by reason was how they thought was the best way to solve problems. This contrasted with their nemesis regions of the Tidewater and the Deep South. The settlers of Yankeedom shunned hierarchy like the Deep South and Tidewater wanted. They instead created a government system of rotating power. And this culture can still be seen today in small New England towns where they have selectmen instead of a mayoral system. You can just see a Yankee coming into a place and they often have strong ideals and a sense of rightness of their cause. And they thought that they were on the right track to creating a more equal society. And this kind of zeal and righteousness kind of could sometimes irritate their fellow nations, which it came across maybe as being more bossy. So they could sometimes alienate others by that view, but that was where they were coming from.
Wow. I definitely see that bossiness. I think of like John Adams and
Mm.
his personality. He was a little bit more liberal than some of the founding fathers from the South, and just kind of that personality of like, I'm right, we should do it this way.
Yeah, definitely. And in every conflict, you can see that kind of coming out, that they think they know what's right. And they're always, tending to push for a flatter hierarchy, more democracy, but kind of not tolerating other people's way of thinking about things, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of the new book out by David McCullough titled Pioneers. And it's talking about these Yankeedom people coming from New England settling into Ohio, the first settlers in Ohio. And they wanted to build this utopian society where it was going to be so great and everybody was going to be equal. And it was very much the idealism. And I was fascinated with this because I hadn't really studied that before. But the interesting thing was once they got there, then they had some other people that were living there. They had some Native Americans who were not thrilled with having them there. And so, you see that play out in a very sad way. Yeah, that is fascinating to think about. And so if you have New England ancestors, maybe you're seeing some of that in your DNA come forward with the bossiness. That kind of cracked me up. Any bossy ancestors or grandparents or parents, maybe, did they have New England roots?
It's probably not so much in the DNA as much in the cultural thinking, and there's a fine line between really believing in your way of thinking, which we all do, and trying to push that too hard on other people and maybe not listening as much. And so I think that's just been playing out in our history where people who have our own ideas in the United States, these 11 nations struggling to work out a single government. And it's tough.
Well, let's move a little south and go to the Tidewater Nation, which includes the lowlands or tidal areas of Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and the Carolinas.
So unlike the more middle-class ethos of Yankeedom, the Tidewater was led by settlers who were the second sons of the British aristocracy. And they weren't going to, like I was saying last time, they were the second sons, so they weren't going to inherit their land in England. So that's what brought them to the colonies. And they wanted to recreate their ideal society. To them, the ideal society was a feudal society with themselves at the top and indentured servants and enslaved people at the bottom. And they wanted to have this paternalistic, mannered, class-based society. They weren't really looking for consensus. They thought consensus was not the way to do things. They thought that the upper classes should be in charge and that was the best way to run society. They had this idea of noblesse oblige, which is a feudal notion that basically says that those at the top are superior, but they had the obligation to take care of the basics for those at the bottom. And so pretty much all of our founding fathers, with the exception of John Adams, were from Tidewater. And you can really see this show up in our Constitution. The founding fathers made sure the Constitution reflected their distrust of the masses in how they set up the Senate and the Electoral College to try to keep power in elite hands rather than in the masses. And along with the Deep South, Tidewater has been the most conservative of nations and often clashing with Yankeedom. But as you can see in the study from Nature Communications, that map that I put in the blog post, that Tidewater has mostly been subsumed by the Deep South. Their ideology is probably still there to some degree. They were important early on, but as time has gone along, they've really been more subsumed by the Deep South culturally.
I wonder if it was because of the Civil War that brought the two together. They united against Yankeedom, and so maybe that was the point where they started, or maybe even before that. They were entrenched in slavery, and they were uniting against anyone that wanted to get rid of that institution. So
Definitely.
that probably had some kind of a uniting effect upon them. When you were talking about the conflict between Yankeedom and the Tidewater, I just couldn't help but think about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who at times were good friends, but at other times bitter enemies. And, there we have the two men that really show the difference.
Yeah, it is. All right, well, let's go up to New Netherlands, New York City.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because it really kind of exemplifies that idea of the first settlers having the biggest effect, because the Dutch were the first there, but actually very few people have very much Dutch ancestry. And so you can really see that the first settlers had kind of an outsized effect on the culture there. So the Dutch of the 17th century were a culture that was kind of becoming a superpower. And, New York was what was called New Amsterdam at the time. And it's just like Amsterdam proper. It was characterized by diversity and mercantilism. The Dutch weren't really as feudal as the other European powers. So when they came to the New World, they were not as democratically minded as Yankeedom, but they had similar ideas about liberty. For the Dutch, they really valued free speech and inquiry. And so basically, the Bill of Rights comes from the Dutch. So those are the things that they prized the most. And even as they were committed to freedoms, they were also really committed to business. And they wanted toleration of diversity that was good for business, sort of above all. And so, like Amsterdam, New York became a mecca of free exchange of ideas and cultures, a lot of toleration, but with business front of mind, which even today fosters new business ventures. And New York is still a place of innovation, and anyone can go there and try to make it there. And just like the Tidewater, the New Netherlands doesn't have a big measurable genetic presence, but the ideas are still really dominant there.
That's a good point, that some of these nations may not be super visible on the DNA nations communities map, but I think you're right that the ideas, especially for New York City, that's such an iconic city with these same ideas still floating around there.
Yeah, as you're talking, I thought, wow, that is such a great definition of New York City.
Mhm.
That's awesome. And I think it's such a melting pot now. Obviously, we had floods of Irish coming in and every ethnicity, Germans, Italians, Hispanic. And so
Mhm.
genetically now you wouldn't see that, but the ideas are still there. Well, let's move to the Midlands. And this is Pennsylvania, parts of the Midwest, upper Midwest, plus Ontario, Canada. So that's an interesting region.
Yeah. Well, this one's near and dear to my heart. So after El Norte in New France and Yankeedom and Tidewater were founded, came the earliest and largest non-English speaking European group, the Germans. They were more in between the liberal Yankees and the more conservative Tidewater settlers. 17th and 18th century German colonists were fleeing wars and hierarchical societies that they felt deprived them of land and autonomy. And so they shunned the semi feudalism of Tidewater as equally as the bossiness of Yankeedom. And the Quakers, even though they had a different culture than the Germans, they were the other main group of the Midlands, and they had settled before the Germans in Pennsylvania, obviously. But the Quakers had also left Europe to escape hierarchy. They wanted to escape the Puritans, actually. So they were obviously not naturally allied with Yankeedom, in the beginning. And so these two different groups, the Germans and the Quakers, formed a moderate nation that above all wanted to be left alone. And along with Appalachia, as we talked about last time, have often been the swing voters of US history. Whichever side the Midlands and Appalachia have chosen in various battles between the North and the South, that's the side that's going to win the war.
So, when we were talking, maybe it was in the previous episode about why people migrated or why they settled where they settled, I think we see, and maybe you can comment on this, that Germans came to German communities because they wanted to have something like what they had in Germany. They wanted to build a community similar to what they knew. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. But what they wanted was a community like they knew, but without their lords.
Yeah, a better
They
community.
they wanted land. I mean, that's one way to really condense what is motivating German colonists throughout time is in Germany. They were coming from parts of Germany where land was becoming more and more scarce, and then the lords were starting to impinge on their what they thought was their land rights, and so they really were coming to the New World to get land because they had the impression that you could get huge amounts of land for relatively little money, and that was motivating enough for them to get on these ships and come to a country that was settled by England, so they were always going to be outsiders in the beginning.
Interesting to think about where they fit into all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I was thinking about when you were talking about Pennsylvania and the Germans was going back to my earlier thoughts on endogamy, because we know that Mennonites and the Amish do have some of that endogamy in their communities. And so I had to go check my question. And sure enough, Acadians and Cajuns are considered to have endogamous populations. So I do think there is endogamy in Louisiana. In fact, there's an article on JSTOR that I didn't read yet, but I found called Endogamy Among Louisiana Cajuns, a social class explanation. So that would be really interesting to read, especially if you have some Cajun ancestry.
So fascinating.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think about, some of the premise of this book is that people married within their nation, right? And so some of them really did that, and it caused that problem of endogamy. So,
Absolutely. And, there could have been a language element there. There could have,
Mhm.
with the Amish, could have been a
Yeah.
religious element, so each one is going to be different and is going to fit in this sort of framework a little bit differently.
Yeah, and maybe some of the ones that were more welcoming to outsiders, you don't see that challenge in DNA research for those, nations who maybe were more open to outsiders.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to Appalachia. This is defined as the highlands from Pennsylvania down to the South Carolina area, some migrating west to southern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and others through Kentucky and Tennessee, and onward to Arkansas and Missouri, and then to Oklahoma, Texas, and into the far west. So this takes up quite a big area.
Yeah, definitely. This is such an interesting group. So the people, the nation of Appalachia were mostly Scot-Irish immigrants who settled on the frontier of the early American colonies. And at that time, the frontier was basically the Appalachian Mountains. And this is an interesting group because back in Europe, they had been on the borderlands in the UK, and they were always fighting the English. The English were kind of coming in and encroaching on their land at times. And so they sort of learned to have these really tough societies where they really depended on their clan networks. So these people started migrating in the 1600s to Ireland, where again, they were kind of a bulwark between England and the native Irish. And then they ended up immigrating to the US and sort of had the same function. They were basically on the borderland between the early colonists and the Native Americans, and they were trying to keep everybody out. And they mostly wanted to be left alone, and they really did not like to be ruled from above, and they wanted to keep their governance inside their community. If challenged, they were ready to fight. So it's not surprising that many of our country's best generals come from the Appalachian Nation, like, for instance, Pershing and MacArthur and Patton were all have family roots in that area. They're incredibly independent in their mindset and shun hierarchy even more than the Midlands did. And they formed a society in Appalachia that was, like I was saying, organized entirely on kinship and not really going for a formal government order.
This is a community or nation that I just didn't know too much about. So thank you for sharing that.
Me neither. But it is really interesting. And it does, you can see it playing out in people's genealogy and in our history.
Right. Diana, do you recognize some of these things in what you learned about the Scots Irish?
Absolutely, especially that statement about them being the bulwark. So they were on the borderlands and they were often fighting. They were in the new country, and the Native Americans were not happy to have white settlers coming into their land. The natives just kept getting pushed further and further west. And so the Scots-Irish, by the time they arrived in Pennsylvania, the Germans had settled all the land. And so they had to go out to the west and fight out on the frontier to make their settlements. And I think that was kind of the way it went all along the way, they had to keep pushing west. One of the things in the book said that there were a lot of them that were just love the adventure. Obviously not all of them, but there were these great adventurers that went ahead and were the frontiersmen opening the way. So when you look at the map, you can see Greater Appalachia is huge. It's very large.
Right. There's like all the middle states. Yeah.
All the middle states, and they all go down into Texas. And I think we're going to talk in a little bit about case studies from my ancestry. But, looking at my pedigree chart, I'm just thinking I've got a lot of those people that were in that area.
And they really did. They all went to Texas.
They did. We very much can see that play out in our family's migration. Well, before we do that, though, we have to talk about the Deep South. We covered this a bit in the last podcast, but let's do a little bit more on that.
So the Deep South, just like Tidewater and Yankeedom, is obviously one of the most important nations in our history, and they're the primary agonist to Yankeedom. Those are the two that are often duking it out, even to this day, I would argue. So early on, the Tidewater, like we were saying earlier, dominated their partnership against Yankeedom, but then eventually the Deep South has kind of come to dominate that side of the conflict. The Deep South's first settlers were second sons of Barbadian slaveholders. And the people who went to Barbados would have been people who were probably also second sons, from England. They would have settled there, and then some of their descendants would have been second sons, and they were the ones who came to settle the Deep South. And they were equally as hierarchical as Tidewater, but without so much of the noblesse oblige. The society that formed in the Caribbean was dependent on the sugar plantations, and those turned out to be very brutal forms of slavery. And many of those enslaved people did not live very long, and that was part of their business model. So unlike enslaved people on the mainland of North America, many fewer enslaved people lived to reproduce because the pressure was so great to produce sugar, which was really kind of the oil of its time. So as bad as slavery was in Tidewater, it was actually much worse to be sold downriver into the Deep South. And the settlers of the Deep South were often outnumbered by African Americans who were in forced labor around them. And this made the founders of the Deep South especially sensitive about any effort to undermine their control.
The interesting thing about this discussion of the Deep South is there were pockets that were different, a little bit unique. I'm thinking of Arkansas, where, a lot of them turned out to be Unionists and did not believe in slavery. That was kind of a state that was divided. But part of it is because they didn't have slaves because the land didn't lend itself. They couldn't grow cotton. They couldn't grow any of these crops that really worked with big plantations, in other parts of Georgia or Alabama. So, it's interesting that this is the whole culture, though, but then you do have these little different pockets as you study different communities and counties.
Definitely. So I think those border states, that's a good point that, Arkansas, for sure, Missouri would have had a mix of populations and of cultures. So some people would have had more of a Deep South mindset, and others would have had more of an Appalachian mindset, because certainly those places were settled by people from Appalachia. And then you had like these huge numbers of immigrants coming in. So it is really fascinating to take sort of this overall framework and try to really apply it to the history of your ancestors' situation.
But when you were talking about politics a little bit, often, even if you were someone that opposed the general culture of the area, the leaders, the politicians and the cultural leaders were entrenched in that Deep South mentality. So, that's kind of how you look at it from a 20,000 foot level, I think.
I think that's how I'm looking at it too.
All right, well, let's go to the left coast, Pacific coastal areas, Los Angeles to Vancouver, BC.
The cities of the West Coast, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, BC, and parts of Los Angeles were first settled by immigrants from Yankeedom. The New England shipping industry made Yankeedom the most familiar of the nations with the West Coast because they were involved in the shipping industry. So when they settled some of these coastal cities, they brought their egalitarian, utopian ideas, and that's what was the original culture of these West Coast cities. And so these Yankeedom transplants, initially they clashed and then blended with the elements of El Norte, who were in some places were there before them, and then the later Appalachian immigrants who came, a fair number of people from the gold rush apparently might have been from Appalachia, plus just all the immigrants coming in later times, all blended together to make the left coast today the most similar to Yankeedom in its idealism, but a little bit more individualistic.
Yeah, that's a good description. And now our last nation, the Far West, which includes interior Pacific coast states through the Great Plains state.
So the Far West was the last nation to be settled by Europeans. Its landscape made it more difficult to transplant the farming and industrial methods that had worked in settling other nations. And so, but because it's more sparsely populated than the other nations, but rich in natural resources, this dynamic of a harsher landscape, fewer people, and rich resources made the Far West into a kind of an internal colony of the other nations that, kind of bred resentment, I would say. So this sort of dependence on the other nations in many ways, but also these other nations were extracting resources from the Far West, kind of has resulted in this kind of independent nation that often has elements of Appalachia, because there were a lot of people from Appalachia that settled the Far West, but it makes it its own nation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, the Far West would be the last one to be settled by the Europeans. And it's definitely harsher with, I'm thinking of, is Utah part of this? With some of the high mountainous areas in the desert. And when our pioneer ancestors first came into Utah, they struggled with trying to figure out how to do farming there, struggling in the wintertime, trying to figure that out. So I can
Absolutely.
definitely see that playing out.
I think it's interesting that the West becomes its own thing because obviously it's people from all the other nations that come, but because of the harshness of the climate and just having to survive, you think of some of the pioneer stories where their nearest neighbor is miles away and they have to survive on their own, up in
Yeah.
Montana. Yeah, it kind of gives you a feel for that. Well, let's get to talking about our ancestors. So I think you've got a couple of case studies to share with us.
Yeah, just some quick case studies just to talk about applying this to our own families. I was thinking about you, Diana, and how you've been reading the book about the Scotch Irish, and it was kind of ringing true with what I had read in American Nations. So I kind of wanted to check it out. So I snuck onto your family search, family tree, and was looking through your Harris Fraser ancestors. And I saw that they were most recently in Texas and Oklahoma. And then before that, they were in Missouri and Arkansas. And then further back, they were in Tennessee and Kentucky. And this is exactly the migration patterns that he talks about in American Nations. And he has a great chapter and different sections of his book on the characteristics of Appalachian people. I thought it was so interesting. I love hearing you talk about your ancestors and thinking about how they would have been moving from farmland to farmland and setting up new communities, and how they would be blending with other nations. So I thought that was a good case study to talk about.
It's fun. I'm looking at my pedigree chart and I've got so many surnames that would fit into that. So I have one that's kind of fun here that I need to research eventually someday. It's a McChristian or McCustian, and the wife is a Mrs. Cherokee native
Oh,
McCustian. That was listed, and this came from Family Search, and I obviously have not researched that, but I'm like, okay, well, we've got a Cherokee, another Cherokee ancestor apparently. And that, you do see that happening because that was where the Cherokees were in that area, Kentucky, Tennessee, and even in the South, we've got the 5 civilized tribes, and you do have intermarriage there. So
so interesting.
fun to think about.
So the other case study that I did was in podcast 149. I was on talking about my ancestors who were 19th century Germans who had arrived in Missouri right at the time of the Civil War. And Missouri at the time was divided between North and South. And it kind of made sense for me of like what was going on. It really helped me picture what life must have been like for them when they were stepping off the steamboat in the 1850s and 60s into this state that was sort of tipping between the North and the South that was kind of evenly divided. And so reading American Nations was really fun for me on that line. And then my dad has one Pennsylvania German, second great grandmother. And as I was looking back at her lines and one line in my mom's family, I was noticing, that they followed the pattern of American nations where they're starting out often in southeastern Pennsylvania and they're moving to southwestern Pennsylvania. And then often families are moving into the Ohio, Indiana, and then sort of into the upper Midwest. It was pretty amazing to see how that, very often that's exactly what the families I was studying were doing. And I had this one sort of outlier family from my mom's side that I thought that would not be covered by American nations. And then as I was reading along, I found out that it was. So that was kind of fun. This one family that starts off in far western Maryland, so just on the very edge of sort of the Pennsylvania Germans, and they were German, and they ended up in Ontario. And so I thought, that's crazy. They must have been an outlier, but apparently Ontario was almost entirely settled by people from the Midlands. And so I just thought that was so fun that it even explained that situation.
It is. I think it's fun. Now I think we're probably all wanting to go look at our family trees and then compare it to the nations in this book.
Right? Absolutely. It's really cool to have a framework and give some more context to where people lived and help us think about migrations, because sometimes migration is challenging to look at through generations, but I think it was very influential for our ancestors, these nations where they went, where they lived, and not all people are going to fall within these patterns, but I think a lot of them are.
Definitely. Even if your particular family is an outlier, it's still going to help you understand where they started from and where they ended up, as to what kind of people they were living amongst.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Heidi. And it was really neat to use this book, American Nations, to help us see more about our ancestors' choices and then the overall pattern and historical forces for migration in U.S. history. So thank you for coming on and talking to us about this.
That was so much fun.
Hopefully everyone listening will be able to use what they learned here to understand the records their ancestors left behind. So we'll talk to you guys all again next week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our Research Like a Pro online course or join our next study group. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our e-course or study group. If you like what you heard and would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.